In an essay called Knowledge in the Classical Age, Serres demonstrates a mathematical concept, the ordered structure, through literary work, La Fontaine's fable, The Wolf and the Lamb. He will use the fable to demonstrate the mechanics of the ordering relation in an ordered structure, but also demonstrate a strategy for moving from a relative relation between 2 points in the ordering relation to an absolute relation throughout the series. This is a way of stabilizing the structure with maximal difference. So the wolf and the lamb, the reason the stronger is always the best, and we will show this shortly. A lamb quenched his thirst in the current of a pure stream. A fasting wolf arrives looking for adventure, and whom hunger draws to this place. Who makes you so bold as to muddy my drink, says the wolf. Said the animal full of rage. You will be punished for your temerity. Sire, answers the lamb, may it please your majesty not to become angry, but rather let him consider that I am quenching my thirst in the stream more than 20 steps below him, and that as a result, in no way can I muddy his drink. You muddied it, responded the cruel beast, and I know that you slandered me last year. Well, how could I have done so if I had not yet been born, responded the lamb. I am not yet weaned. If it is not you, then it's your brother. Well, I don't have any. Then it's one of your clan. For you hardly spare me. You, your shepherds, and your dogs. I have been told that I must avenge myself, upon which, deep into the woods, the wolf carries off the lamb and then eats it. So, the wolf is the victor, and he eats the lamb. Now we'll discuss structure. Structure is a mathematical term of algebraic origin. It designates a set of elements whose nature and number are not yet specified, but if one specifies the nature and number of the elements of the structure and the nature of the operations, then a model becomes evident. Accordingly, a structure is an abstract set of formal operations that can be concretized into a variety of physical models. And the structure can also be described as a formal model with physical variations or submodels. The simplest example of a structure is the ordered structure or linear sequence, which is a set of elements with an ordering relation. So here we have a representation of the formal model, points A, B, and C on line D. The ordering relation for these points is based upon predecession or succession. A precedes B, which precedes C. C is the successor of B, which succeeds A. The relation is irreflexive. Also, because A precedes B, B cannot precede A. And so that relation is anti-symmetric. And then finally, A precedes B and B precedes C, so A must also precede C. And that relation is transitive. So irreflexive, anti-symmetric, and transitive, those are the properties that define the nature and number of the set. And this is the basic formal model of the ordered structure of linear sequence. Serres also says that the mechanics of linear progression lead to a trial. So what does he mean by this? Well, he's connecting linear process to scapegoating or the sacrificial solution. Centralized power sustains itself by demonstrating defeat over enemies maximally opposed to its concentration of power. So the paradox of being a king or a central authority is that the king is blamed for both the good times and the bad times. So in really, really bad times, either the king is blamed and sacrificed and replaced by a new king, such as the phrase, "the king is dead, long live the king," or a scapegoat is blamed and sacrificed in the king's place as a substitute, so the king can remain in power. The scapegoat is a substitute for chaos that threatens the social order, and whose substitute is the king. And so the scapegoat's expulsion is justified and necessary. The scapegoat is satanized or aligned with a more powerful adversary who must be defeated. And then a trial is held where the public mobilizes against the scapegoat, judgment is cast, and the scapegoat is defeated and expelled from the city, or expelled to the afterlife in an act of public sacrifice. The trial delineates how the gesture of expulsion underlies linear process and centralized power. So the first model is a biological model. Here the ordering relation is defined by the reason of the stronger. A cannot be stronger than itself. If A is stronger than B, B cannot be stronger than A. If A is stronger than B, B is stronger than C. A is stronger than C, there's irreflexive, antisymmetric, and transitive. The ordering structure defines the stronger animal, then that's the nature number of the biological model. The absolute case is the strongest, and that's he who has no predecessors but only successors. Next is the ethical model. The ordering relation for the ethical model is defined by the better. A cannot be better than itself, irreflexive. If A is better than B, B cannot be better than A, antisymmetric. If A is better than B, B is better than C, A is better than C, transitive. That defines the better animal. And the absolute case is the best, he who has no predecessors but only successors. And the game strategy is to move from the relative to the absolute, to extend the relation to the absolute case. Then the chain with links becomes a stick or a chain without links. So that's the game strategy. The reason of the stronger is always the best because the stronger becomes the strongest when the relative case becomes the absolute case. Next is the topological model. The ordering relation is spatial and it's defined by upstream and downstream river current. It's sequential and irreversible. That defines the nature and number of the topological model. So the wolf is drawn to the stream by hunger and not thirst. The wolf is upstream from the lamb, so all of the arguments for how the lamb is muddying the drink of the wolf, they will fall flat because the wolf is upstream. So the spatial context matters. The fourth model is rational. The ordering relation is based on causality, and so that's the nature number that defines the rational model. Cause precedes effect, which succeeds cause. So this whole sequence of the fable will be defined by causality. All of the arguments for why the lamb is muddying the drink or is not muddying the drink will be based on causality. Next is the fifth model, which is physical. The ordering relation is purity mixture. That defines the physical model based on thermodynamics and principles of entropy. So maximal energy is upstream and dissipates downstream to lower energy. Then we have the sixth model, which is political. The ordering relation is king and subject. That defines the political model. So the lamb calls the wolf sire and refers to him like a king, and so the king is absolute. He moves from the relative to the absolute case. No one is above the king. So if no one is above the king, then no one can be the cause of the king's dismay. This is a maximal move. The reason of the stronger is always the best. So he makes move from the relative to the absolute case in order to defend himself. The seventh model is temporal. The ordering relation is before and after, so it's based on time events and time, chronological time. I know that you slandered me last year, but I wasn't born, so how could I? Defends himself with time. They're blocked by the flow of time, birth, and death. And so this whole sequence, I wasn't weaned, I hadn't been born, I couldn't have done it. Defends himself with linear sequence models. Then the genealogical model, it's defined by parent-child relations, ancestor-descendant sequence, kinship. I'm not yet weaned. If it's not you, then it's your brother. He tries to associate him with his brother. He doesn't have any, but one of your clan. Then that's the genealogical case. Then the social model, protector, protected. And here he'll refer to shepherds and dogs. Well, this is the maximal move because actually the shepherds and dogs are above the wolf. They're more powerful than the wolf. So in the domain of power, they would be above him in the linear sequence. And this is the maximal move to associate the lamb with someone who's upstream from the wolf. If he associates with someone who's more powerful, then the wolf is justified in killing the lamb. So he plays within the rules of the game. So here we have an example of one structure with 9 models. This also demonstrates the case of the one and the many, the one structure and the many models, or ideality encoded in materiality. And that could also be multiple examples of the same idea. The ordered sequence is preserved as a hidden order in various models. And also the structures are preserved in the logical architecture of the text or the fables. And so we also see the linear mechanics of 3 properties and game strategies including maximal moves, moving from the relative to absolute case. Here's the game space for the fable. The stronger and the weaker relation defines a biological model, better and worse, the ethical model. Upstream, downstream, the spatial model. Cause-effect, the rational model. Purity and mixture, the physical model. Dominator, subject, the political model. Before and after, the temporal model. Ancestor, descendant, the genealogical model. Protector and protected, the social model. And so finally, the greater, lesser, majorant, minorant is the maximal move. And Serres says, if an order is strict, he who occupies the lower position, let us call him the minorant, has no control over the majorant, who on the contrary has complete control over the former. So in the fable, the wolf and the lamb use the third man to effect the rule of the game, which is the law of the trial. He who is greater is responsible and loses. And so the trick is to use the third man and align the opponent with the third man. This is the maximal move. This way one is justified in attacking and eating the other opponent. The wolf plays in the order either the lamb or the third man upstream of himself, and the lamb on the contrary plays himself downstream. Whether dealing or drinking, eating or dying, the succession of moods in the games follows the ordering relation. You are the stronger, I am the weaker. You are upstream and I am downstream. You are the cause, I am the effect. You muddy it, I cannot muddy it. You slandered me last year, I have not yet been born. It must be your brother, I do not have any, and so on. The lamb shows at every move that he or the third man is absent from the upper position where his adversary places him. In short, the wolf majorizes or maximizes the lamb, who minorizes or minimizes himself. Everything is played upstream from the wolf. However, are the places there occupied or vacant? How is this going to determine the result of the game? So theorem 1 is that the lamb wins. It would be necessary to show at every move that the place is vacant, and this is exactly what the lamb does. In addition, in the ultimate instance, he no longer proves the place's vacancy, but rather its inexistence and the game is over. The wolf is the king. He says, sire, in majesty. He does not have a majorant. He's in the absolute position, like an absolute monarch. Not only is there no third man, but it's impossible to conceive of one above the king. Therefore, the lamb is one, and the wolf has no majorant. He himself is the maximum, but then there's theorem 2, and there the wolf carries him off, and nonetheless he does it according to the rules of the game. So what does he do? Well, he succeeds in showing the existence of a third man upstream of himself in the lamb social group. This is because the shepherds and dogs, or the protectors of the flock, are in reality much stronger than the wolf, and so they retain upstream the constant possibility of doing them harm. So the wolf wins within the rules of the game because he aligns the lamb with a third man upstream of himself. They are above the king wolf, and they are the strongest and maintain the absolute position. This is a game of moving from relative to absolute. So there's 2 strategies for defeating dialectics in hierarchical struggle. Hierarchies are subject to couplets founding on ordering relations that are subject to massive displacements and shifts. In a contest, a competitor is not always assured of winning. A player is stronger at a given moment because of a given move can later fail when his opponent discovers the means or obtains the power to pass upstream of himself. The dichotomy then appears to reverse itself, and the weaker is taken the stronger's place. In fact, it is the entire couplet which is displaced in the game space, structured by the ordering relation, and this displacement is infinite and does not stop as long as one stays in the same space since it's relative. It's the infernal time of hierarchical struggle and human unhappiness. So there are 2 and only 2 strategies. Strategy 1. First one stays in the dialectical game and tries to discover a martingale in order to win. Whatever the move might be, the game is over and there's a definitive dominant. A martingale is a double down move to override a prior deficit. It can be a dialectical move where one thinker turns another thinker on its head, turning the entire hierarchical system upside down. Old times are over and the struggle will stop under the insurmountable power of one of the contestants. It's a maximal move that freezes the game space in a single pattern of order and hierarchy. It's the end of a slice of history. Strategy 2 is to attack the hierarchy itself. You attack the order structure itself, which is a condition of the game's existence, or rather without which the game can have neither space or time, and then you shatter it. This move would mark the beginning of a new history. And he says, strategy 1 is a part of foundationalism. You double down with a maximal dialectical move. You turn a hierarchy on its head. This is the time of continuous hierarchical struggle. The strategy 2 is non-foundationalist, because here you dislocate or generalize the structure. And this is non-foundationalist, multiplicitous, pluralist, decentralized. And he says philosophers have rarely taken the second path because they've always tried to find the maximum and minimal points at the edge of the game space, organized by the couplet to flip the majority and minority. And as soon as that's discovered, one can always say otherwise. It's always determined. Note that the maximal move strategy 1 is a play in triangulation. The wolf repeatedly identifies a third man upstream of himself that is aligned with the lamb. This is how he wins according to the rules of the game. If the lamb is affiliated with shepherds and dogs, protectors of the flock, then the wolf becomes a minimal player who is justified in defending himself. He uses the third man to triangulate and reposition the lamb by aligning him with the third man, and he becomes a weaker player. Serres also uses triangulation in his model of communication, but to an entirely different effect. Recall that in his communication model, the sender and receiver of the communication act in unity against the third man, who personifies noise. Noise is chaos, interruption, accident, and the complexity of the material world, all of which are the backdrop to a successful message relay. In the communication model, sender and receiver act as 2 against 1 to noise, the third man, the adversary who confuses and delays, but who, upon defeat, relays his successful message. Communication unites the 2 parties, who are equal to the extent that they can both recognize a common set of signs, symbols, and behaviors. So we see here two different examples of the self-other relation. The first dialectical model, the other is satanized and aligned with the adversary. This produces maximal differences and inequality. This allows for scapegoating and expulsion under the trial or linear procedure. And then the communication model, self and other are united in communication. This produces equality and stability, and communication expels the noise, and this is done with a nonlinear framework. And then also logo analysis, we see two different ways of comparing events. Under the first way, chronological linear historicity, this model will show a simple order, usually aligned with a historical perspective and a foundational view. This is usually aligned with the linear progress narrative. Event 1 and Event 2 on this model are maximally differentiated. So Event 1 is usually consigned to the distant past, having little or nothing to do with our contemporary modern practices. And so oftentimes Event 1 is framed as ancient and Event 2 is framed as modern. Under the nonlinear model, this model is usually aligned with mathematicity rather than historicity. It shows a complex order, usually viewed from multiple perspectives, and it's presented in a non-foundationalist view. This again will be examining nonlinear narratives, and Event 1 and Event 2 on this model are in communication. Serres' development of dialectics and hierarchical struggle is confluent with the work of his colleague Rene Girard, who pioneered work on the scapegoat mechanism. For Girard, our choices are not driven by an independent will, but by mimetic desire. We don't desire things in isolation based on independent will, but rather we choose what we want by mimicking the desires of others. Girard recognized that protagonists in classical works of literature often emulate their desires on another model character or an ideal. Similar to how people commonly strive to emulate the characteristics of celebrities, role models, or mentors. In other words, we desire what others desire and mimic their behaviors in order to achieve those desires. Our desires are then not autonomous but triangular, such that we want the same things as what others want and those we emulate. This is represented as follows. A mediator desires an object, and a desirer desires an object because of the mediator. Our desires are mediated through another who is ideal or a social rival. In the latter case, mimetic desire can result in the mediator becoming a rival for the desired object if they are within the same social group. This creates a dynamic where one desires to destroy a mediator in order to possess the object of desire, and violence here is justified. As early social groups settle into collectives, animalistic dominance hierarchies dissolve as objects of desire circulate and mimesis spreads. In this state of affairs, people from different social groups increasingly desire the same things, and this results in mimetic rivalries and wars of internal division that destroy the social fabric. But according to Girard, the groups that ultimately survived this state of affairs were those that were able to channel all of this social furor and uproar into a targeted and focused attack on a scapegoat, an individual within the community selected to take the blame for all of this social uproar and furor. Just as today, modern governments utilize evil other rhetoric to demonize political adversaries and justify the mobilization of multi-year war campaigns, early social groups demonstrated in their records and mythologies the practice of scapegoating a member or a small group of members internal to the community, and this might be done as a ritualized sacrificial practice or as a practical judicial tribunal to punish members of the collective who in any way threaten the social order. Generally, the scapegoat is either innocent or at the very least subject to exaggerated accusations. Girard calls this act of ritual sacrifice and targeted blame the scapegoat mechanism. Its purpose is to ensure social cohesion by producing widespread cathartic release that restores peace and order to the social body. The scapegoat victim might be expelled from the city or even brutally murdered in a public display of human sacrifice. The mechanism highlights a social impulse to blame evil and social chaos on a single source that can be vanquished to the satisfaction of the collective. Although the scapegoat mechanism is based on false allegations for the most part, it works so well that early social groups utilized the ritual sacrifice mechanism to benefit greatly and prosper as a result. The scapegoat mechanism formalized the violent foundation of human societies and the ugly means by which they sustain themselves. Girard identifies the scapegoat mechanism as operative in a variety of myths, legends, and historical narratives, including Oedipus, Jesus Christ, Job, Cain and Abel, Joseph, Romulus and Remus, the witch trials, the Black Death persecution of Jews, Nazi anti-Semitism, but also modern political scapegoating and evil other rhetoric. Serres would also expand this to include intellectual martyrs like Hippasus, who exposed the irrational exception to the Pythagorean theorem, or Socrates, who corrupted the minds of the Greek youth. Also Galileo, Archimedes, Giordano Bruno. Serres broadens the scapegoat mechanism to include the sacrificial trials of scientific thinkers who were ahead of their time and got caught up in dialectical struggle. The scapegoat mechanism is also popularized in the contemporary fictional story of Omelas. Omelas is a utopian city where happiness and social perfection depend upon the neglect and perpetual misery of a single child who is kept locked in a windowless room. The moral wager of Omelas is whether the utopia of the collective justifies the misery of a single innocent child. Like the adherents of ritual sacrifice collectives, the citizens of Omelas mostly accept child abuse as a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. For Girard, societies are built on a lie and foundational murder that grants cathartic release. Rome is a classic example, built upon the founding murder of Remus, killed by his brother Romulus after a quarrel on where to build the city and who should rule. The founding murder can memorialize and ritualize the scapegoat mechanism. The mechanism works so well for early societies at achieving a prolonged and sustained peace that the sacrificial victims, once satanized and falsely blamed for the social chaos, later became divinized and falsely credited for ending the social chaos. As a result, ritual sacrifice in early societies, according to Girard, became a mechanism for transforming victims into local heroes and tribal gods, who were both good and evil, possessing the power to both create and end social chaos. Girard's books locate the scapegoat mechanism at the foundation of a variety of ancient cultures, as read through their myths, legends, and histories. The supernatural characteristics of the sacrificial victims were not real, of course, according to Girard, but were the results of social projections. Because these myths are told from the perspective of the persecutor, the supernatural effects are presented as real, because to reveal them as projections would destroy the mythic power of the gods and obstruct the effectiveness of the scapegoat mechanism. Human sacrifice, once practiced in ancient societies, continues today only in the limited sense of an accidental, unanticipated social cost of our scientific advancements. Our technological achievements add to the human lifespan and pretend to make us healthier and safer. But despite our technological achievements, which are meant to ward off death, limited tragedies still occasionally resurface to remind us of life's fragility. Serres' book Statues presents a logo-analytic portrayal of how the sacrificial deaths of ball worship are structural precursors to the tragic deaths of the 1984 Challenger space shuttle explosion at Cape Canaveral. For Serres, tragedy and loss of life were, in both cases, carefully calculated to be limited, restricted, and minimized. Serres adopts generally Girard's thesis that the scapegoat mechanism is rooted in the anthropological origins of social organization and existed as a social strategy for managing collectives through ritual sacrifices, but also that the mechanism operates as a pressure valve to periodically release social fury. Serres takes the example of Baal worship in Carthage. Baal was a storm god that originated in the Levant among the Canaanites and took his fearsome character from the ferocious winter storms off the Mediterranean, which were much fiercer than the tamer storms that characterized the fertile Crescent River region. Baal was condemned by Jewish and Christian texts and was famously featured in the Bible as the false god who was outperformed by the mightier storm god Yahweh in the sacrificial rite contest between Elijah and Baal priests. Baal is represented by a large bronze bull statue, an idol by Christian standards, that was erected in the public square filled with animals, enemies, children, and scapegoats, and heated to a cherry red fire, liquefying their bodies under the watchful eyes of the public, who pretended their screams were the bellowing of a bronze beast. So, how are these events, which seem to have no relation whatsoever, actually connected? Well, Serres notes that although these events seem to have no relation, because one of them takes place in ancient times and the other takes place in modern times, they actually are quite similar. So how are they similar? Well, the statue in Baal worship is the center of idol worship. It mediates a relation between heaven and earth, where humans are sent to the heavens through the afterlife. It comes at a large socioeconomic cost, and specialists are used. They're different from the common public. And the acts themselves are acts of judicial rectification or ritual acts. Also, the acts are done repetitively over and over again so that they can release social furor on a regular basis. Now, how do we compare this to the modern rocket Challenger explosion? Well, the rocket itself is also an object or a statue. It's a technological rocket. It mediates a relation between heaven and earth, sending humans into outer space. It comes at a large socioeconomic cost. Specialists are used that are different from the common public. And here, the deaths were not ritual acts, but ascribed to technological accidents. But nonetheless, this event is viewed by the public over and over again as a social safety valve mechanism. And so these two events are very, very similar. They just have a different point of view. Simple and complex. Baal worship and the Challenger explosion are also united in the ideal of collective immortality. The notion of culture is not ensured, but it must be built and preserved or else it will perish. Religion and technology are social survival strategies for cultural preservation. Cultural preservation through religion and technology yields collective immortality as the ideal of cultural preservation. So typically they do so by securing a vertical binding relating heaven and earth, and also a horizontal binding that secures social organization. Under the dialectical historical view, we tend to view ancient rites as old and primitive, and modernity as new and advanced. Likewise, we tend to privilege the newer sciences over the older and outdated humanities. These are a consequence of linear arrangement. And so, as an example, we divide the study of cultures into two different forms of study: anthropology, which studies old cultures, and the social sciences, which studies new cultures. The point is that the sciences are aligned with exact knowledge, and the humanities are aligned with inexact or superstitious knowledge. In Serres' book on religion, he provides a solution for subverting the scapegoat mechanism. The solution comes in the parable of the stoning of the woman in the Bible. Pharisees brought a woman to Jesus and said, "This woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Moses commanded that she should be stoned. What do you say?" So Jesus bent down, wrote with his finger in the sand, and then he stood up and he said, "Let he who is without sin be the first among you to cast the first stone." So what did Jesus do? Well, Jesus absolved the woman by multiplying guilt and undoing the binding of the many against the one. None can cast the first stone because all are guilty of sin. All are guilty of sin, so all must be forgiven, absolved, shown mercy, in order to avoid the war of all against all, a war of attrition. And so dialectical war, or the war of many against the one, here ends in absolution or mercy. Dialectical struggle is generalized for the network. Moral judgment based on good and evil, which are maximally opposed, are dislocated and generalized by the equality of the network, where subordination does not exist. Recalling the two ways to defeat dialectical struggle from the wolf and the lamb, Jesus takes a second strategy to defeat the hierarchical system. He dislocates the structure that binds the collective against the sacrificial victim. He destroys it by multiplication. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. All are guilty. The multiplication of sin makes mercy the only feasible option. Do not judge. All are guilty of sin. Sin is multiple, and so all deserve mercy. This is the way out of the dialectical struggle framed by our knowledge of good and evil. Good and evil are the most fundamental and maximally differentiated points of dialectical war, and an optimal example of a relative order that is absolute dies. The shift from judging based on the knowledge of good and evil, or dialectics, is refraining from judgment and showing mercy, which is akin to the shift from the line to the network. Subordination does not exist in the network, so the simple ordering relation between good and evil doesn't apply.
In Part 3, we'll look at sundials, which, according to Serres, are not just an ancient technology, but a form of artificial intelligence.